You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs. All right, we are back and we're here to actually talk about a subject that I felt like it was important to go back to. We've done a lot of deep dives into fascia and myofascial release. And what I really wanted to do with this episode was do more of an introductory episode to those who haven't done MFR or maybe who are newer to it as well, or haven't really studied much about MFR, but use it a lot to give you some insights. Of course, we have a lot of other podcasts that go into details on the what, why, and how, and the scientific research, and we'll link to those. But for this one, what we really want to talk about more is implementing and using them and the user side of things and things to pay attention to and cautions and why we love it and how our practices have changed over the years and how we use it and how we implement it in a yoga practice. So really kind of the what, why, and how of the introduction to MFR, whether you're brand new or have just not really thought about some of those details before, which is totally normal, right? A lot of times we just start practicing and feeling, which is a great way to start. And when I do workshops, I always like to have a little bit of an intro, but really I think just using these techniques is really how you learn a lot. So whether you're new or practiced, we welcome you and have a nice little conversation lined up for you here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this one because of that. If you skip that foundational step, if you've missed these conversations somehow in the previous years, there's a whole lot of nuance now. There's a lot of granularity around the texture of the tool and the duration and the direction. And sometimes it's best just not to worry about all the details so much and just get started and notice your experience.
Yeah. And so just as a side note too, in one of the research roundups that we'll link to on MFR, we talk more on specifics like the research behind duration and frequency, speed, intensity, different types of tools, and more of a research-based approach. And this is really more an experiential approach, conversational approach for those who are newer or those who are new to teaching and using it within a yoga practice. Because, as you probably already know, it's not a traditional part of a yoga practice, but such an important tool, I think. And obviously you do too, Rachel.
Yeah. It's just one of those things that seems to really work with students. It gives them something really concrete and tactile and unique and memorable. And it's a great way, I think, to cut through the clutter. So I love to have it as a tool that I can draw on when I need that ability to kind of break through and give them a new experience.
Yeah. And I'll just do a little bit of background on me too. I know for me, I came into MFR through my specialty really when I started seeing patients 20 years ago was sports medicine. And for me, I started using myofascial work with my own hands on my patients. I've always been a really big advocate of myofascial work. And it's nice to have a practitioner who's trained in that, who can be really specific and individualized to whatever you're working with. But for me, I also really wanted to be able to give my patients tools. I wanted to be able to give them things that they could continue to do the work between the treatments so they weren't completely dependent on me. That was always really important to me. I've always had a really busy practice, but I've always really wanted to empower people. I've also always had a lot of yoga students who were really proactive, which was great. So providing tools for my patients and my yoga students was always super important to me. And I quickly found that this myofascial release was so helpful for enhancing my outcomes and also speeding up the recovery for a lot of the conditions that I was working with too. So over the years, as you can imagine, I've refined it quite a lot. I've trained teachers in integrating it with in yoga practices for 15 plus years. And I can say I continue to do it and will for many years to come, because it is such a crowd pleaser.
Mm.
So it's something I enjoy personally as well.
And my first introduction was obviously from you, but as part of learning anatomy, you would give us a visceral experience of the muscle in practice through myofascial release. And that really struck me as a unique way to get to know a muscle, as opposed to just visualizing origin and insertion, or maybe palpating. Having this really concentrated experience of what does it feel like when I put pressure on that muscle, or add a little bit of body weight and some movement. You kind of get an experience in your body that you can add to the intellectual experience in your brain.
Yeah. And I think that segues us a little nicely into this just quick little moment of talking about why we love it so much, which
Mm.
we've already kind of begun to talk about. I think, we often mention in teacher trainings, I often say at the beginning, the MFR, regardless of what the training is, from orthopedics to mental health to nervous system, like the MFR is just such a great place to start, because I really find not only are the effects really instant, which is hence the crowd pleaser part,
Mm.
but it also helps them really commit to a routine. Yoga, for me, oftentimes is more of a long-term goal. And so getting people to commit to doing these practices, these therapeutic practices every day, can be really challenging with our busy lives.
Mm.
But I find with MFR, it's quick, it's easy, it feels good, and it's really easy to get people to commit to that routine. So I usually encourage our teachers, and I use it myself first. And when I'm giving therapeutic modalities to patients or yoga students, and then they have the routine muscle built, so I can
Mm.
also sneak yoga poses in there too, which I find works really well. So that's one of the things I love about it.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I would add a couple. One being, not everybody is just born with the skill of interoception, or maybe they are, but they lose it at some point through their lives. So a lot of the questions that I ask students, tell me how that feels. How does this side feel compared to the other side? Not everybody has answers for, but usually when you explore an area with myofascial release, it's a lot easier for them to tap into, the feeling's much stronger on this side, or on this side, it's really more located toward the front of the hip, whereas on the other side, I feel it kind of broadly all around. It kind of trains their capacity to pay attention to details and then to shape them into language that they can communicate with you. So it trains that skill set of what am I feeling? How is the feeling changing? Or even, doing myofascial release and then taking the props away and noticing the changes that occur. Is it warmer? Is it buzzing or tingling? Does that side feel longer or heavier? Just builds a skill set that I can then use in the rest of their practice. So that's one. And in these days
And
of often,
actually, before you go on, and I
yeah.
think just to emphasize that, I think that part in and of itself is so important. Like,
Mhm.
don't underestimate that. And those of you who work or who are teachers or healthcare providers or fitness instructors or coaches, like, how hard it can be to teach body awareness to people and this body sense. And it's one of the gifts that yoga brings us. However, it's also one of the challenges, because a lot of times we come in, we've become so out of tune with our bodies because we're so busy in the world. It's not, due to any problem, but it's a natural event. And so
Mhm.
being able to tune in isn't always an automatic thing. And so even if that was all that MFR did for us, I
Yeah,
think it would be a
it would
huge
be
win.
plenty.
Sorry. So keep
No,
going.
it kind of leads into the other thing that I use it for, which is these days working so often with people remotely. I can't physically palpate tissues. And to be honest, I've never been great
Mm.
at that anyway. I've never been a hands-on body worker. I'm not fond of people doing hands-on body work on me. And so having the student do their own body work and then
Says
report
the
back.
woman whose parents are both body workers.
I know, no offense, Mom, no offense, Mark, but it's not for me. No, to rephrase, if I'm injured, I will definitely seek them out for help and I experience relief. But, some people just love therapeutic touch. I'm not that person. So for me, having the tool there both puts the student in charge. It's not up to me to feel and then gauge what I'm feeling and report back. It's their experience. And it can be a quick way to kind of do an assessment on what are the tissues that stand out. So if I'm working with somebody remotely and I'm not able to observe the real details of their experience like I can in person, giving them a little bit of myofascial release to do on places that I suspect could be problem areas gives me some juicy information to start with. Like, yes, that spot on my shoulder was much more tender on my injured side than my uninjured side. Tells me there's something there to work with. So I kind of use it as an assessment tool, if that makes sense, especially when working with people remotely, when I'm not getting the same kind of density of information as I do with somebody in person.
Yeah, and I think that's a great note too, that even someone who doesn't like body work and someone myself who really does, we can both enjoy it and benefit from it because it
Yes.
really is a self-care modality. And
Mhm.
even if I am really good at palpation, it is still subjective. So I have to
Mm.
be able to ask and collect that information because it's as if not more important than what I'm feeling. Obviously, if you are a body worker and have sensitivity in your hands, you might also be able to sense and feel other things, but I still need to know their subjective experience. And
Mm.
I think for me, being able to teach people how to do this on their own is a form of self-regulation. So
Yes.
it's and self-soothing, and we'll
Yes.
talk about other things as well. So and you mentioned also one thing that I love too is also teaching anatomy and my anatomy course that I
Mhm.
have out that is, it really is such a helpful tool. I hear from so many people all the time being able to feel the muscles instead of just trying to memorize them. So
Yes.
if you're learning anatomy, it's a great way to learn it and an accessible way to learn it as well. So
And I guess an undercurrent in all of that is that it really puts the student in charge. We're
yes.
kind of building up that muscle of them taking charge of what they do and when they do it, and how much pressure they add and how much intensity they seek. And I think that's a really good skill set for a student to develop, especially when they're working with something therapeutically, to kind of take back some of their own power and to have things that they can draw on to help themselves feel better and just to get to know their condition in a more detailed way.
Yeah. And I think we could probably go on for a long time about the things that we love because it's also in the other podcasts. There's a million,
Mhm.
I think, molecular things that we love and pain related things that we love and nervous. Like there's just so much.
Mm.
But I also think that our use of this has also changed a lot over
For
the
sure.
years.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think for anyone who's used it for even maybe even a couple of years or a year, it's probably changed. And even more so for those who look at the body of evidence too and research behind it, our knowledge has changed a lot. And so I think as a community, the way that we practice has changed a lot over the past couple decades too, at least
Mm.
from my experience, and I'm sure from yours as well.
Yeah, I know for me, I used to use props that were a hell of a lot firmer. I had these black, dense lacrosse balls that I have one left just as a kind of relic of the past that I like to poke every now and again and go, damn, I used to lie on top of that thing. And now the props that I use are much softer and much more forgiving. And I'll much more often put a prop over the top to kind of blunt the impact or broaden the surface area. I definitely take a much more subtle approach than I did to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's a place for everything as far as the size goes too. I think
Mhm.
even lacrosse balls for some people can be helpful, especially like someone was asking me just recently how to work with larger body students and students in the abdomen.
Mhm.
And those large lacrosse balls can come in really handy if you have a larger bodied student and they're not feeling anything. Now,
Yeah.
I mean, don't assume that just because they have a larger body that they're not feeling
Yeah.
anything, of course. And don't assume that your smaller bodied people are feeling things too. I think it's always good to have options for everybody. So in a soft kind of underbelly area there, if people aren't feeling anything for whatever reason, those larger lacrosse balls can be an option versus the larger blow up balls, which we really love
Yes.
too, which are actually
Yum.
a lot softer and less intense. So
Mhm.
it's really experimenting, in a lot of different ways. But yeah, I think a lot of people, especially in the athletic realm and sports realm, usually start with those lacrosse balls or tennis balls. I think
Yeah.
I always tell people the tennis ball is a great starter myofascial
Yeah.
ball just to
Cheap,
see if you
available.
like it. And then if you
Yeah, they
like it, you're going to want nicer ones at some point that
yes.
are kind of sticky, that don't slip around, that maybe a little
Hasn't been chewed on by
softer.
the dog.
that won't pop isn't
Collapse.
quite the word. Yeah,
Yeah. No,
collapse.
they do. They resist a certain amount of pressure and then they just give way completely. That's the thing that frustrates me about tennis balls that made me go eventually
Yeah.
to the recovery rounds that are more
Ugh,
predictable in their
so
pressure and their
nice.
resistance. But you've also hit on something else that's changed in the way that I teach, which was to begin with, I had, written down really detailed instructions based on the experience that you'd given me. And that was how I'd teach it. It would be, we start here and we do 2 inches and then we are there for 30 seconds and then we go another 2 inches and then we're there for 30 seconds. And you want to be exactly at this angle. And over the years, I've gotten a lot less directive and a lot more sort of exploratory. We all start in the same place. And then I feel like I'm just kind of listing a range of options. You might lean in and lift the knee off the floor, but you might back away and
Mm.
windshield wipe your foot and shin from side to side, or you might explore how the outside feels or how the inside feels. Or so I've gotten a lot broader and more invitational in my language, and maybe that's been shaped too by a lot of my students now having experience and having their own favorite things to do.
Yeah, and I think it's the inviting them into that exploration and self-discovery. I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
really is, a big part of the practice isn't just the mechanical changes in the tissues, but also, like we said, our ability to self-regulate and also
Mm-hmm.
our ability to be able to listen and adapt and support
Mm-hmm.
ourselves in a way, that we're learning from and watching how our body responds to and really sensing how it changes. And I think also over the years, as the science has been updated, because the fascia has been a big topic of research, we start to realize that there's a lot of different reasons to do this too that might not require a lot of heavy-handed pressure
Mm-hmm.
in MFR and in body work. I think there's a lot of movement toward that in the body work world, and I think there's really a time and a place for everything. But, when we're looking at the hydration of the tissues and the gliding of the tissues, or enhancing proprioception in these neurologically dense tissues, the fascia, enhancing interoception, I think there's a big case for more isn't better. And, there's also the question too in the research of, are we even able to work into the deep tissues, or are we even able to really break up, in quotes, scar tissue, especially really palpable, significant scar tissue? Do we
Mm-hmm.
need to? Can we be
Mm-hmm.
functional without it? And so, I think all of this has changed it. And I think the biggest one for me is the fact that many of us live on sympathetic overdrive. And myofascial release isn't necessarily just that mechanical change to the tissues, but it's also helping to regulate the nervous system when we go with this gentler, slower melting pressure to
Mm-hmm.
talk with those Ruffini endings. We can have a really, I mean, that might be your biggest intention, is just to shift the nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think over the years, a lot of us as a whole, just in the myofascial community, as well as yoga medicine community, as well as you and I, have shifted to more subtle techniques, which is
Mm.
for many reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, along with that sort of more broad, more invitational, more kind of exploratory approach, there are some areas of the body that I'm a little more circumspect about teaching now, especially to groups. So areas where the muscles, in my perception, are kind of really finely tuned, like around the neck or the jaw or the temples. I don't as often teach in groups as I do with individuals, where I'm able to ask a bunch of questions, especially for people who are subject to tension headaches. Everything's nicely balanced. And if I mess with that balance, maybe they'll be completely fine. 99% of the time they are. But I have had a couple of experiences where the person has then had headaches triggered from maybe working a little bit too enthusiastically on finely tuned tissues. And so now I tend to teach those where I can have a conversation, do a little bit back out, see how you feel. Feels good? Great. Okay, let's do a little more, as opposed to teaching them en masse. But that's just a personal thing, I think, built on my experience.
Well, and I think anytime you're working really therapeutically, meaning, for instance, like you said, headaches, if I
Yeah.
was trying to work on helping someone with their headaches, I do want to be there in a one-on-one setting to be
Yeah,
able to ask questions and watch how they're responding. For instance, if someone's having headaches, there's a lot of great local MFR that can be helpful for a lot of people, and for
for
others
sure.
can trigger a headache for them.
Yeah.
And so, in those cases, I like to always encourage people, this, but to work indirect before direct. We're
Hmm.
always trying to look at other places we can look first, which is hard to do in a group class because you can imagine there's a lot of different things going on and a lot of different people. So you can't do indirect on everyone. But I think just like the yoga practices, we have to really engage with our students in a way that encourages them to be proactive,
Hmm.
listening, and then adjusting and modifying, even if that's just moving the ball a centimeter in one
Hmm.
direction, to find what I always say is the spot that you can work with, meaning
Yes.
it's not the most intense spot that I'm just gripping and holding my breath. It's one that I can work with and soften in and lean in. It's that middle path again.
Hmm. That damned middle path. We keep talking about that thing. I talk about that as well. Find something you can work with. You know, the Goldilocks amount of sensation, I'll sometimes say, like not
Yeah.
pain, not nothing, somewhere in the middle, somewhere that feels like it's responding to the actions that you're taking, somewhere where you don't have to grit your teeth or hold your breath, but there's a conversation going on. And I'll also do, it sounds really simple, but I'll also model on myself. If I'm doing myofascial release and for any reason it doesn't feel great today, I'll say, here's where we're heading. I'm not going to practice that one today. It's not feeling great for me. So even in my teaching, I'm showing every day's different and I'll show you where to go, but I'm not going to stay there because that just doesn't feel good for me for whatever reason today. And that's a simple thing, but I think can have impact with students to then feel that they have permission to move or to back up to something that did feel good or to take an alternative or head to child's pose or, whatever their out might be, just reminds them that they're in charge.
To listen. And I think too, the reminder that listening hopefully also implies that you're responding to that too. So
Mm.
that you can grab a blanket and put it over the block or the ball or the foam roller if it's too intense, to soften it, or grab another prop to support some of your body weight so that all of your body weight's not over the ball or the
Yeah.
roller. And so, and like you said, when we work with students who have practiced this for a while, they become really familiar with that. And so, the first time, if you're teaching an introduction workshop, you're gonna have to say a little bit more. I like to make the
Hmm.
discussion at the beginning of the workshop short and really put a lot of it in as we're going so that people get into feeling it. So maybe
Yeah.
like it's 10 minutes, quick introductions of cautions and things to be conscious of. And usually that is finding areas you can work with, props. But then like you'll find that your students obviously grow with you too, and will start to learn that and find those
Hmm.
things. And I just love watching
I mean, I had a
that.
class just yesterday where I was teaching some very specific regions of myofascial release. And then I look around afterwards and there's like 3 or 4 people doing completely different parts of the body because they were like, yes, we've got the balls today. She'll be off chatting. I'm working this sticky little spot on my shoulder, which again makes me really happy because they're just taking the opportunity to listen to what's going on for them in the day and respond accordingly.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about how we use it,
Mhm.
where to put it in your practice, before, during, after, because I think these are all really interesting points, especially for either teachers who are newly using this or for students who want to use it. Because I love that, on the Yoga Medicine online site, if people practice with us, you might find a technique that you like that's really helpful. And so I always recommend that people, when they find those things that really make a big impact, to come back to them. And that could be just during your day, or it could be when you go to practice. And the beautiful thing about practicing online is you can just push that pause button or do it before or after, which is so brilliant and amazing. I
Mhm.
love that we have this potential to really learn from our practices and then individualize it on our
Mhm.
own while we're watching online stuff, which is so cool. I love
Yeah.
that. And I love
It
when people text me on that or message me on the comments and are like, I did this and this. And I'm like, yes, it's
Yes.
working. They're learning, they're
Yeah.
adapting.
It can be a really powerful bridge from a led practice to a self practice where you don't have to do all the thinking, but you are building that muscle of interoception, of listening and responding, which I think we don't always have such overt permission to do in person practices, unless you're one of my students
Yeah.
and you're just going rogue with your myofascial release. So,
Although
yes.
I don't know about you, but I almost 95% of the time like to be guided. I actually just did your class today, one of the ones with
Did
blocks. It
you?
was wonderful. Yes.
Oh,
So there's
bless.
something about just being guided though,
Mhm.
right? You know, and just holding that space. Like I'll usually schedule them in my calendar with the schedule on the Yoga Medicine online site so that I just have a space held for it. And then
Yes.
you're holding the space for me. And then I'm also knowing if I have this or that going on, I can choose whatever class I want. If I can just
Mhm.
throw that little thing, myofascial move in.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love
So,
that too.
okay. So let's talk about timing. And I think,
Mhm.
let's talk about before versus during versus after. Um, let's start there. What you want to kick it off? I'll let you start if you want.
Yeah, I tend to follow a general kind of guideline. And as soon as we start talking about guidelines, every rule can be broken, but it just helps to know what they kind of are to start with. So when I'm using myofascial release before a more active practice, I tend to keep it pretty light, relatively quick. I don't go super deep, meaning I probably won't do a lot of like shearing where I'm leaning body weight on and moving the neighboring joint. Maybe a little, but nothing that generates really strong sensation, not spending a huge amount of time in any one place. And I'm thinking of it like the approach, the intention that I'm giving it is just preparatory. We're bringing in blood flow, bringing in circulation. I'm connecting to this part of my body. I don't even really need to change anything, but I'm just kind of connecting to it and getting us all set so that we're on the same page when we start to move. So that's how I approach the beginning. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts?
No, I agree. I think of it as preparing. Even
Mm-hmm.
like the during, to me, the beginning and during are like preparing the tissues. And for me, if I'm doing it at the beginning, a lot of time it's enhancing proprioception. Like
Yes.
you and I both love doing feet. I love doing
Mm-hmm.
feet before I start. So it's one I often do when I'm practicing on my own. That's one I'll throw in at the very beginning. Maybe even
Mm-hmm.
while the teacher is going through an intro is a great time to do it because
Mm-hmm.
usually there's 30 to 60 seconds there that you can do and you might pause it still. But it really is engaging with the tissues. It's enhancing my body awareness, but it's also enhancing that proprioception in this neurologically dense tissue.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a spot that you're working with, I can be specific to that. But yeah, quick, gentle. I don't want to create soreness. I
Mm-hmm.
might do a little bit of shearing for functional movement, but it
Yeah.
it really is like either the tissues I plan to use or the tissues that I'm working with for some reason
Yes.
to prepare.
Yeah. And I
And
would
then
add from a teaching perspective, I tend to sequence in if I'm going to do myofascial release early. I tend to choose parts of the body that obviously I'm going to use, but that are pretty approachable. So, what do I mean by that? Feet's a good one. Hands might be a good one. I might do some light work on like quads or shoulders, but I'm probably not going to do super sensitive tissues. Say for me, the abdomen, um, hip flexors. I probably wouldn't spend much time on the side of the pelvis or like the external rotators of the shoulder. Any tissues that are super tender, I'm unlikely to sequence at the beginning unless I'm prefacing it with this could be tender, so make sure you set up so that the sensation is really gentle. I just want you to connect to these tissues because we're going to use them in a moment and I want them to be familiar. But I do want to start off with a sort of encouraging tone, and I don't want students to have a taste in their mouth of, wow, that's really tender at the beginning of practice. So think of it as kind of my psychological setup.
I will say though, there's definitely exceptions to that. In fact,
Yeah, for
I
sure.
love one of my favorite things to start with is the diaphragm and the belly because breath is such a
Fuck.
huge part of what we do
Yes.
and it really helps with the breath. So it is one of my favorites
Yeah, I find
to
that one
start with.
super confronting. So I enjoy it. I personally would never do it early in practice in my own body and would never do it with my students. And I'm also like, if this isn't feeling good today, you could roll on your back and palpate with your fingers. So my biases definitely cloud the way I teach that location.
Yeah. And I think that's natural. I think as a teacher, you have to teach what resonates with you,
Of
because then
course.
it's more natural. And I think there's something for everyone out there. And then you're going to draw those similar people toward you. You're going to have people that really enjoy what you're doing. It's going to feel
Yeah.
natural and authentic to you, rather than teaching something that someone's told you is best. So,
This will feel fantastic. This is everyone's favorite. Yeah. Unhelpful languaging.
but do set expectations. If you're going to do the
Yes.
rotator cuff first,
Yes.
make sure you're prepared with options and modifications for all of them. I mean, anything can be tender to someone. Even the
Yes.
most gentle spots might feel awful to someone. So be prepared with modifications. Set expectations if you know it's going to be a 10. If you start out with that IT band, you might want to laugh about it and let them know we're going to get the worst part over first.
Yeah. And we won't be here for long. And you don't worry, it's going to feel great by the end.
Exactly.
For sure.
So then when we get to during, I think this part's really interesting, and I really use it during the practice, especially when I'm doing a challenging pose or a peak pose or a pose that's challenging for me, as a way to help them get into the pose or to get deeper into the pose for whatever reason. For instance, the one thing I think of first is back bends, probably because I'm back bend challenged. It's never been my easiest point, but everyone has their challenges, right? So if I want to prepare the tissues, for something that's challenging, it's really helpful to do it right before, because we know, especially if you're not moving, but even in a yoga class where you are moving, some of those effects of the MFR will wear off over time. I think that's a lot less so in my experience when you're moving and using those muscles, we're actively using them. But I think if you're going to use it to prepare for something, sometimes I like to do it right before. For instance, one of my go-tos for back bends that really helps is two areas. One, rectus femoris. So working on that middle quad that crosses the hip, and then shoulder work, lats. I
The
mean,
lat
for
pec
me,
combo for overhead back bends.
those are
That's
really
exactly
big.
where my head was going. And I love overhead back bends, but I would still
Right.
love sequencing. Let's try dancer's pose with an overhead bind catching the foot,
Yeah.
and then do the myofascial release on lats and pecs, maybe rectus femoris as well. Let's come back to the pose again and see if you notice a difference. So they kind of get into that sort of investigative mindset.
And I think what you said too just nailed it right on the head too, that also teaching them to learn about their bodies. If I'm doing this, especially in a workshop or a class, they're seeing that huge shift. I mean, there's some that's just like, it's undeniable. You roll the hamstrings, you do Uttanasana, especially if you roll one side, you really feel the difference between the two. So it's a great way to educate them and tune them into more of that fine-tune awareness, because even just rolling and then sensing the tissues might be pretty subtle for a lot of people. And so getting to feel it in that overhead back bend. And so I will say though, for myself, sometimes, it's not always about getting deeper into the poses, right? So I always like to steer people. Well, I steer myself away from that just because it's what I love, because I don't think we've talked a lot about it on this podcast, that going deeper into poses doesn't necessarily always make people feel better, especially if they don't have the active control. So sometimes it is nice I do like the sensation or the challenge of doing something like wheel that isn't easy for me, to feel into those tight areas, or perhaps make peace with needing them to go away or needing to go deeper in a pose. What you need perhaps is right there, or perhaps a modification. So, but with the MFR, if you're trying to help yourself in some of these postures, it can be really fun and interesting, and a great way to help people see the effects of the MFR is instant.
And I'm also willing to work a little bit more intensely, and I'm, still not super intensely, but I'm willing to do work here that is more sensitive, or to stay a little bit longer, or to work a little deeper, say adding some body weight and some shearing movement through the joint. Because in the beginning where I'm thinking really light, really quick, just kind of shaking hands, creating connections. In the middle, I'm like, let's see if we can change things. Let's see if we can make these tissues feel whatever I'm looking for, more elastic or warmer or more hydrated or more mobile, or, you know, whatever the aim I'm going for. I'm probably going to be working in a little bit more intensity here than I would in the beginning, knowing that straight after I'm going to have them moving and I'll have that make nice kind of flush out moment of that won't be the lingering aftertaste that they're left with. Hopefully it will be the, wow, this now feels quite different when I go into the next movement or the next shape.
And I would say one last thing too, I would add is that this is where I usually, not always, every situation is different, but I'll often use shearing techniques as a way to create more of that functional movement between the tissues to restore that movement. So if you're familiar with that, I mean, usually if I'm, without going too deep into the details here, if I'm working through one area, basically with a myofascial ball, I'm just trying to move the joint nearby. So, you know, if I'm working on my, well, let's see, if I'm working on my rotator cuff, this is an easier one to wrap your head around, and I've got the ball behind my shoulder blade, just rotating the arm a little bit can be really helpful. If you're working on the rhomboids, maybe just finding some little arm circles there. So trying to pin down that superficial layer with the ball and then move the deeper layer underneath it by moving those muscles that you're on top of. And it doesn't need to be painful. It doesn't need to be a lot, but even just a little bit of movement can be great. So we've got before practice to prepare the tissues, light and gentle. We've got during practice to prepare for a specific pose or movement or limitation. Like if you know you have a specific limitation, that could be where you pause the video to do the thing that's helpful for you.
Yes, love that.
And then the last one is after. And for me, it's usually one of two things that I'm doing it at the end of practice. One is either for tissue recovery, and this could be post yoga or post sport, post training as a way to help with recovery, in which case it would be more gentle, more broad, or for more of that parasympathetic tone to down regulate. And in a yoga setting, this is probably the most common reason I do, is to get people to relax. Like, so thinking about areas that are relaxing, like the back and the hips, maybe some people the neck, maybe not.
No, for sure. And yeah, I'm thinking about ideally they're sort of on the way to Shavasana. So things that you can do lying down or where your weight is mostly held for you, places that the average person, because the more you teach myofascial release, the more kind of general information you get as to most people enjoy this one. Most people find some significant tenderness here or whatever. I tend to go more for the crowd pleasers toward the end, ideally supine or a lot of the weight supported by props back, and just general work on the neck as opposed to super specific work like the suboccipitals at the very base of the skull. Just beautiful as the last thing before Shavasana. And, you know, because these muscles are so involved in positioning our head to keep our eyes level, letting the eyes soften, letting the gaze broaden, just a beautiful prep for Shavasana. Yum.
Right. So many great ones. And, you know, I think that broader contact can be really nice, especially for recovery with a foam roller, so I can get bigger chunks of tissue and be less specific. You know, I really want to be more specific if I'm working on range of motion before or during class to a specific area. But at the end, especially if I'm working on tissue recovery, usually I want to get a broader area. And for the parasympathetic effect, it's just areas I can, like you said, be on my back, that I can relax, that I can melt into slow pressure. So instead of rolling over the glutes really fast, it's staying with it and thinking about just relaxing and melting into it, maybe using some longer exhalations to help support that as well. So a lot of great ways you can implement it into a yoga practice or within a training session too. Same thing would apply if you were doing another training modality before, during, after. Same thing. If there's range of motion limitations, you might want to do right before, like during your training session, right before you did the thing that's difficult for you. Or if you just want to prepare the tissues just before your training session, or recovery at the end. So really similar format.
And I wanted to mention too that I take a slightly different approach when I pair myofascial release with yin. Or maybe it's not that different, but that previous discussion on the before, during, after, I was really thinking in the context of active movement, movement where we're supporting our weight or making large, like vinyasa like
Yeah.
movements or sport like movements. In yin, one of my favorite things to do is to do myofascial release on a region first, kind of shake things up, stir up the snow globe, and then head into this lovely, long, melting yin pose targeting the same region. So I'm imagining
Mm.
shaking up circulation, blood flow, perceptions, habits, allowing them to find their way to something new, some new configuration or new orientation. And then at the end of the yin pose, I might find some really mellow movement for that joint as a kind of final rinse. So that combo for me personally feels fantastic.
Mm.
And it's something that people tend to respond to too in classes, because often in yin, when you're talking about a targeted region, it can be difficult for people to make that transition from, am I doing the outward shape right, to, am I setting myself up correctly to feel it in the right location? And sometimes getting that
Mm.
pinpointed feeling from myofascial release first of, oh, that location, no, I'm not feeling that in this version, but if I shift my hip over here or move my knee over here, now I'm getting the targeted area. That can be a really good setup for yin.
And I think I really love it both ways, before yin, after yin,
Yeah.
during yin.
Yeah.
But I think also beforehand, it also helps people, especially who are coming from a really busy or stressful day, just to be able to tune in for not,
Mm,
it's not always really easy for everyone to shift right into yin mode. For some
yeah.
people it is, for people who've practiced a lot, potentially so. I actually really love it at the end of a yin class to work
Mm,
with the tissues in a different way, but then also to go deeper into that parasympathetic. I mean, I like both,
mm,
don't get me wrong. And one thing I will say is, for people who are on the more flexible end of the spectrum, you might also want to do it at the end, because as I release the tissues more, they might have trouble feeling things in a yin practice because they're not feeling any tension on the tissues as well. Especially, I'm talking about much more flexible people. So I've seen that too sometimes. So just experimenting with that. I don't think
mm,
there's a right or a wrong way to do it, in my opinion, before or after yin, but noticing how it can affect you in different ways
mm.
and be used in different ways too.
And I thought you might add something about acupressure points, because this is an area that I don't know much about, but I know I get a lot of in practices with you of specific points with intentions that are drawn from traditional Chinese medicine. Anything you want to say about acupressure?
Well, I think just what I want to say, because it definitely is a much longer topic, but what I love about the
Like
MFR.
most conversations we start on this podcast, it could be at least one podcast of its own, and maybe will be someday.
Yeah, TCM is a longer topic, but for those of you who are familiar with TCM, and I do acupressure on the Yoga Medicine online practice site too, so you're probably familiar with some of it from there if you
Mhm.
practice with us. But what I will say is that you can also use MFR as an acupressure modality, meaning if you're familiar with the points and you have one that you want to work on, usually it's just more a matter of finding a way to support yourself, finding the right tool, leveraging your body weight over that tool so that you can relax and stay for at least a minute or two. But keep in mind that anytime we're doing MFR, we are impacting this energetic system, whether it's precisely on an acupuncture point or somewhere in the location of a meridian. In Chinese medicine, the whole body is energy. And the idea is that when things are able to flow as they're naturally meant to, the body can heal and repair and check and regulate. It's a transportation mechanism, like we know with our blood circulation. And so, helping to improve that flow of blood, of chi through the body can help in a lot of different ways. And again, if you're familiar with the specificity of the acupressure points, you could also use that. One of my favorites is right in the armpit. So anytime you're doing that foam roller in the armpit, again, if you can regulate the pressure, it's a great one for fibromyalgia and
Mm,
whole body pain. Spleen 21, the suboccipitals, our
mm,
gallbladder 20, great if you feel like you're catching a cold, great for headaches, great for tension, moving liver chi, which is kind of like our stressful energy in our body. So there's a bunch of them. Obviously, there's hundreds of acupressure points, and some are easier to get to kind of apply in a myofascial modality. Some are easier just to use your fingers.
Mm.
So,
And
but it's
something
great
that
to
I take
layer.
from it, even though I don't know all that much about acupressure or about traditional Chinese medicine, something that I take from that practice is the importance of intention. That you could do myofascial release on exactly the same place in the body, and having a different intention going in would probably really change the outcomes that you take away. Like, say I'm
Mhm.
working with the center of the sole of the foot, and I'm thinking about proprioception and balance and preparing myself to be more stable in my practice or my sport. Those will be the benefits I'm likely to take away from it. Whereas if I'm doing myofascial release on the center of the sole of the foot, and I'm imagining drinking in energy from the earth and sending this energy, this deep reserve of energy up through my legs and into my body to support and sustain me, same outward practice, it would look exactly the same to somebody watching, but the internal feeling or takeaway could be quite different. And so I think there's a real area of fun in myofascial release to kind of play with the intention that you're putting into the practice.
Yeah. And there's so many more uses for MFR, especially in a one-on-one setting. So
Mm,
great for pain. Though I will just say, as a side note, I think it's really important to also look at the other parts of the pain. I mean, for instance, we've talked in this podcast on beliefs around pain,
mm,
experiences with pain, as well as stability and strength and neurologic control and range of motion and our nervous system. And many of those MFR can help with, like, I think of it as enhancing our GPS so that
mm.
neurologic information or that neurocontrol, we know that it helps with range of motion. We've talked about it helping downregulate the nervous system and enhance that parasympathetic tone. So there's so many different therapeutic implications, but it gives us
Mm.
kind of a big picture scenario to look at. So real
Mm.
quick, as we wrap up, what are your favorite locations? What are your favorites
Yeah, we've mentioned
in a
feet.
class?
Feet,
In a
feet,
class, yeah.
feet, 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 feet.
Yes.
Suboccipitals, mentioned that already. Base of the skull, lovely, lovely. Whether you're working on, text neck, or whether you're just getting people ready for shavasana, or whether you're thinking about tension headaches, suboccipitals, lovely, lovely. That armpit one that you talk about that I love to hate, block or foam roller doing pecs, serratus anterior, and lats. So helpful, less enjoyable for me personally, but definitely really helpful for arms, chest, shoulders, neck, breathing, you name it. And oh gosh, if I had to pick one more, maybe posterior shoulder, because it's kind of so hard to get to other ways. So metal traps,
Wow.
rhomboids, infraspinatus, erectors, that kind of
I feel like I
landmine
just learned
region.
a lot about you.
I'm sure nothing you didn't already know.
I would definitely, I mean, those are definitely all high up my list. I would
Mm,
definitely say the diaphragm is high on my list. And I would definitely say the posterior and lateral hip, as
yeah,
well as the back. I mean, for me, if I want to engage with the parasympathetic nervous system and downregulate stress, like slowly rolling down the back, couple of
yeah,
inches at a time,
yeah.
staying for a minute or two or three, maybe
Hmm.
even while you're watching a movie and forgetting and staying there
The
for
cardinal
several
sin.
minutes.
Wait,
You could stay
what? See,
there.
this is always something I say when I'm teaching myofascial releases. This is not something I would do while watching TV or watching a movie. I really want to be engaged in the process. This is fascinating. So tell me, you still get the benefit even when you're not paying attention to the sensation? Shocked.
Well, I definitely think therapeutically it's better not to have a TV, but I sometimes like to multitask. And at night, I for sure will watch TV and roll my back, my hips, my feet, whatever I need to.
You
And of
heard it here
course,
first,
that
people.
the impact for me, it's usually more maintenance. Like if I
Yeah,
need to do something therapeutically, I'm going to give it some time and attention. But if I
yeah,
want to do more of a maintenance and I'm really familiar with them, I know,
yeah.
I'm very familiar with what I need. So yeah,
So that's
why
really
not?
interesting
Good.
because there's no myofascial release that's in my maintenance program. All of the stuff that's in my maintenance program is strength and stability. It's, leg lifts and side planks and single legged standing stability and posterior shoulder strength, and all the stuff that I need that I find much less enjoyable to do is that strengthening side. I don't have anything in my toolkit from myofascial release that I do every day or every couple of days.
See, that's why you have to do it while you're watching TV or a movie, because well, we talk a lot about it. The MFR, it's not necessarily about just range of motion for me. And obviously the strength work is so important as we especially go through the second half of our life.
Yeah.
And I think, however, the connective tissue is so important for so many reasons beyond the scope of this podcast, but maintaining that health of this connective tissue is really important. And for me, I really like it at the end of the day too, just to down regulate and shift. And, sometimes that just happens to be while I'm watching TV.
Yeah, I love that. You've just proved me wrong. Not for the first time, and not even for the first time on this podcast.
And even sometimes while I'm watching zombies.
No, anything but zombies. No. I may have nightmares tonight, people. But no, I love that. And I think it's really important for people to hear that there are different approaches, and that probably our approaches will change over time. I have no doubt there'll be a time in my life where I need a little bit more regular myofascial release. Right now, the second I kind of turn my attention away from my muscles, they just chill. And I need to be like, hey guys, remember, you can engage as well.
And I think it is all subjective as well, too, just like the zombie show. For me, it's entertaining, and for others it might be scary,
psychologically disturbing.
So just like the MFR, we are looking for ways of creating safety, and sometimes that's through laughter, and sometimes that's through calming, relaxing techniques or MFR. Sometimes that's through pranayama or meditation. There's so many great tools. So, really ultimately you have to decide what's best for you. So I want to end with common pitfalls, cautions, things to be conscious of. I think a really important one. Maybe we should have started with this, but we're ending with it.
We'll finish with it, damn it.
Let's talk about first the three main things to avoid. Now, anytime you have a significant diagnosis or healthcare issue, I think it's always great to chat with your doctor in primary care. And, I would just ask about massage, and, they might tell you not to massage locally to whatever your condition is, or to not massage at all. It's pretty rare, but some conditions, it is important not to do that. And, I'm not going to go into all the details because there's a lot of different conditions out there. And I do think it's important to have a conversation with your doctor. But for the big picture perspective, what we want to think about is avoiding three main things. One is bone, mostly because bone's not going to change with MFR, and it'll just be masochistic for no purpose. We're often really close to bone. You might be rolling on muscle that's on top of bone, like the infraspinatus, which is on the scapula. But I'm not just going to rub on a bony prominence, which, most people don't want to. That's pretty intuitive. The second one is also pretty intuitive, is avoiding nerves, which basically means let's just lump that together with intense pain. None of this is meant to be painful. So we are looking for areas that are tender as an area that needs potentially a little bit of work and support. But I want to avoid areas that are painful. So even just moving the ball half a centimeter in one direction can change the experience entirely. So looking around, exploring. And then the third and last one is avoiding areas that are really visibly swollen, because obviously if you had a sprained ankle and you were to roll over that swelling, it's going to create more swelling. So again, most of these are pretty intuitive. But if you do have a health condition, it definitely is important, I think, to talk to your healthcare provider or a physical therapist if you have that. Whoever you're working with is, I think, a really important one.
I think that those are a really helpful place to either start or finish the conversation when it comes to where you're looking to work and where you're not. The other big pitfalls, I think, are in approach. And one approach that I see less often these days, but definitely a lot more when I first started teaching myofascial release, was people going hell for leather, full body weight, maximum pressure, maximum intensity, screwing up their faces, completely miserable and absolute agony. And I definitely see less of that now because as I teach, I'm repeatedly saying shouldn't be painful, should still be able to breathe pretty freely, should be able to relax your face. Often you get better results from working next to the most intense area and not in the middle of the most intense area. So just taking an approach that's a little bit more compassionate to your tissues as opposed to imagining that you're going to physically break up adhesions by simply sheer force of will and intensity of sensation.
Right. And I get that a lot in trainings too. And I remember when I mean, even I don't know if it had to do with me first starting to teach it or me learning too and us learning from the research, but there was a time that it was a really big challenge for me too. And, I think it can be hard to gauge people into the more subtle, especially if you work in athletic communities. But what you
Mm.
have to do as a teacher is just if someone wants to keep grinding in there, that's okay. But just hope that you can kind of plant these seeds over time,
Mm.
invite them into the curiosity to explore, and be open to the fact that if someone feels like more is more helpful to them, and that's okay too. And,
Yeah.
I think it's like yoga too. Everyone wants different things and needs different things. And for me, I'm really happy for everyone to explore yoga in their own meaningful way to them. And the
Mm.
same is true for MFR. So just know that as a teacher, if you're trying to work toward that with your students, just planting little seeds over time as to why it's important
Yeah.
or why it might be helpful that less is more,
Mm.
and educating them is really the key. And knowing that sometimes, maybe you only have half of the attentions, right? So,
Yeah.
it might take months for your regulars to catch on to that. And that's okay. So be
Yeah.
patient.
Or they may never change. And I think you're so smart
Yeah.
to add that in at the end of the day, it's their practice and it's their body. So they're in charge.
Yes.
And I guess the
I
last
love that.
pitfall that I would add that you may disagree with, I'm going to be curious to see is if you're having to do myofascial release on a region of your body every single day, then it's probably worth investigating other practices as well. Like maybe there's something that needs some strengthening and engagement. Maybe there's something that needs general down regulation. Maybe you could achieve that aim with a different practice. What are your thoughts
I
on that
think
one?
your key word there is need. If they
Need.
need to do it every day,
Mhm.
and granted, it's a therapeutic process. So for a while, if I'm working with an injury or an issue,
Yeah, you might
I
need
may
to.
need to do it every day for a while in conjunction with other practices. In my
Mm.
experience, it's rarely an MFR only thing,
Yeah.
unless I have someone who's clearly there's no mechanical issues in the tissues and it's more this central sensitization or issues potentially with the nervous system.
Mm.
And then maybe it is primarily MFR, but even so, if they've had that long enough, there are changes in the tissues at some point
Mm.
pretty quickly. It's not as long as you think. So, it's really rare that I'm just going to be doing MFR with someone. However, when it is a painful scenario, that might be a really important part of it for a while.
Yeah.
So need is the key. I'm
Yes.
fine if people want to do it different. Like for me, I'm not doing it every day. And even if sometimes I will,
Yeah.
I'm just doing the areas that I want to do. Like it feels so relaxing at the end of the day for me to roll my back just because it down
Mm.
regulates my nervous system or, my feet at the beginning of the day just as this kind of awareness and awakening and balance.
Yeah.
So again, need is the key word
Yeah.
and
I love that.
that's okay to need it for a while.
Mhm.
But if the need turns into long-term thing and it becomes a crutch, then I really want to explore. For me, it's an empowerment. Yoga and MFR, these are tools to empower people to live their lives and not become dependent, but to enjoy them and appreciate. Just like yoga, you could say
Yeah.
the same thing. Like, do you need it every day? Maybe. I mean, I do think we all need to move. We all need something.
I think my
So,
partner would say, yes, I do need it every day, or I become a
yes.
rampaging bitch. But I choose to disagree.
I
No, I love
love
that.
it.
I think that's a really important distinction, not just for myofascial release, but for everything. Do we
Yeah.
really need it, or is it a story we're telling ourselves? Mm.
And I think I totally agree with, the nuances being really helpful. Less is more, working indirect before direct, especially for painful scenarios,
Mm.
not replacing this for your medical care or your other modalities, your three-dimensional program
Mhm.
to, work with the tissues and, using it as a helpful empowerment tool. So lots of great takeaways, looking at one, how it can be really helpful, how we can use it in a yoga practice, both before, during, and after,
Mhm.
some cautions and pitfalls and things to be mindful of, and really just appreciating this valuable tool that is so, I think, accessible, also
Mhm.
individualized and impactful.
Yeah, I love that. And some differences of opinion, which I think are always so fantastic to remind people that there isn't a way. There's no one way, there's no right way, there's no wrong way, but yet another tool for investigation and a chance to get to know yourself a bit better.
Yeah. And also, we can come back full circle too to the importance of MFR for so many different things, but also even just for self study.
Mhm.
So lots of great takeaways. Less is more. Enjoy the process. Get curious, experiment,
Mhm.
notice what feels helpful to you, and find a way to use it to support yourself, which hopefully will be changing over the course of your lifetime many, many, many times. But now you have this tool in your pocket and an easy one to travel with. I usually throw my balls in my suitcase
Yeah,
because they're
same.
easy to fit.
Mhm.
And it's a nice little tool to have when you're traveling too. So hopefully this has been helpful. Let us know in the comments. Anything else you want to add, Rachel?
Well, we'll link to previous podcasts that dive into some of the more granular detail about myofascial release. And we can link to a couple of yoga medicine online practices too for people who want to sort of intro, put their toes in the water and see how it feels.
Oh, and then for teachers who are curious, who want more, we have a short myofascial course for students who are
Hmm.
interested in learning a little bit more. And then we have our full length teacher training on myofascial release, which goes really deep dive into the science and the research, really understanding what the fascia is, how it works, how we can support it. We've got over 100 different protocols for every part of the body. So you
Mm.
can really understand the what, why, and how behind it. Really helpful, especially if you do therapeutic work, yoga teachers, healthcare providers, coaches, fitness instructors, Pilates. Like I've heard from tons of different mindsets to how
Yeah.
impactful it can be for the people they work with. So, or
I
pain
think
specialists is a big
of all
one.
of the
Yeah.
yoga medicine trainings I've done, that would be the one that had the most immediate impact in terms of the tools that I had to call on in my teaching. So I would agree. I can't nod vigorously enough. I can't agree emphatically enough. That is a really worthwhile training to do.
Awesome. Well, this was perfect. I hope it's been helpful, and we will see you next time. Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.